In the summer of 2018, a French antique dealer named Philippe Rousseau was clearing out the attic of an abandoned farmhouse near the beaches of Normandy. Beneath rotting floorboards and 70 years of dust, he found something that would send chills down the spine of anyone who understood what they were looking at: a metal ammunition box, rusted but sealed. Inside, wrapped in weathered cloth, were dozens of letters written in English. Letters from American soldiers, letters that were never sent home. One collection stood out among the rest: 3 envelopes, each addressed in the same shaky handwriting. The name on them: James Robert Mitchell, Private First Class, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. The dates: June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day. The night before hell itself would open on the beaches of France. But these weren't ordinary last letters home. These were confessions, secrets, truths so devastating that someone decided they should never reach their destination. For over 7 decades, these words remained hidden in the darkness of that French farmhouse, waiting to tell a story that would challenge everything we think we know about the men who fought on that terrible day. This is the story of James Mitchell, a young man who went to war carrying more than just a rifle. He carried guilt, forbidden love, and the weight of choices that would haunt him in what he believed were his final hours. What did he write in those letters? Why were they never sent? And what happened to the people whose names were written on those envelopes? The answers are more heartbreaking than you could ever imagine. The USS Samuel Chase rocked violently in the dark waters of the English Channel. It was just past midnight on June 5, 1944, and Private James Mitchell sat on his bunk in the cramped quarters below deck, trying to steady his trembling hands. Around him, 2,000 men prepared for what they all knew would be the most important and possibly the last day of their lives. Some men prayed. Others sharpened their bayonets or checked their equipment for the 100th time. A few tried to sleep, though the combination of fear and the ship's constant motion made that nearly impossible. But James did what he always did when the world became too heavy to bear. He wrote. He had 3 letters to write, 3 envelopes already addressed and sitting on the thin mattress beside him. The first was to his wife, Sarah Mitchell, back in Lawrence, Kansas. The second was to his best friend since childhood, Thomas Brennan, who had been rejected from military service due to asthma. And the third, the one his hand hesitated over the longest, was addressed to Margaret Hayes, Sarah's younger sister. James Mitchell had not always been a man divided. 2 years earlier, in the spring of 1942, he had been a 20-year-old high school English teacher with a modest apartment and simple dreams. He taught American literature to teenagers who were more interested in the war news than Shakespeare. He spent his evenings grading papers and his weekends at church socials. His life was predictable, safe, and entirely unremarkable. Then he met Sarah Hayes at a community fundraiser for the war efforts. She was 23, a nurse at the local hospital. With dark hair she wore pinned up and eyes that seemed to understand suffering before you even spoke of it. They courted for 6 weeks. He proposed on a warm May evening beside the Kansas River, and she said yes without hesitation. They were married that August in a small ceremony attended by both their families. For 8 months, James thought he had found the kind of happiness that other men only read about in books. Sarah was kind, intelligent, devoted. She made their small apartment feel like a home. She talked about children, about the life they would build together after the war ended. James wanted to give her everything she dreamed of. But then Margaret came to stay with them. Sarah's younger sister was 19, fresh out of high school, and had taken a job at the munitions factory outside of town. She needed a place to stay while she saved money for her own apartment, and Sarah insisted she move in with them. It was only temporary, Sarah promised, just a few months. Margaret's was everything Sarah was not. Where Sarah was thoughtful and measured, Margaret was impulsive and wild. She laughed too loud, stayed out too late, and challenged every conventional idea James had ever held. She read poetry that was too modern, listened to jazz music that was too provocative, and asked questions about life and death and meaning that made James uncomfortable in ways he could not articulate. At first, he found her exhausting, then fascinating, then, God help him, irresistible. It started innocently enough. Late-night conversations in the kitchen when Sarah was working the night shift at the hospital. Discussions about books and dreams and the world that would exist after the war. Margaret talked about leaving Kansas, about seeing Paris and Rome and all the places she had only read about. James found himself telling her things he had never told Sarah. His fear that his life was too small. His suspicion that he was meant for something more than teaching indifferent teenagers in a town that never changed. The first kiss happened on a Tuesday in November. Sarah was at work. James and Margaret had been drinking coffee and arguing about a Hemingway novel. She said something sharp and clever, and he laughed, and then, somehow, they were closer than they should have been. And then his hands were in her hair, and her lips were on his, and the world stopped making sense. They both knew it was wrong. They both swore it would never happen again. And then it happened again, and again. For 3 months, while Sarah worked and saved and planned for a future with her husband, James and Margaret conducted an affair that filled him with equal parts ecstasy and self-loathing. In February 1943, James received his draft notice. Part of him was relieved. The war would remove him from this impossible situation. It would give him a chance to become the man he was supposed to be, the man Sarah deserved. He told himself that distance would cure what he felt for Margaret, that time and hardship would burn away the weakness in his character. But on his last night before shipping out to basic training, Margaret came to his room. Sarah had already said her goodbyes and gone to bed early, exhausted from a double shift. Margaret stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, and whispered the words that would haunt James across an ocean and into the hell of combat. She was pregnant. James left for war the next morning, carrying a secret that felt heavier than any rifle he would ever hold. For 16 months, through basic training, advanced infantry instruction, and the gray month stationed in England preparing for the invasion, he received letters from home. Sarah wrote about her work at the hospital, about the victory garden she had planted, about how much she missed him. She wrote about her own pregnancy, discovered 2 months after he left, about how happy she was that they would have a child together, that he would come home to a family. Margaret's letters were fewer and more cryptic. She had moved out of Sarah and James's apartment. She was living with an aunt in Topeka. She never mentioned her condition directly, but James understood. She had found a way to handle it. Whether that meant an illegal procedure, an adoption, or something else, he did not know. She did not say, and he did not ask. And Thomas, his best friend, wrote cheerful letters full of home front gossip and encouragement. Thomas, who was secretly in love with Sarah and had been since high school. Thomas, who had stepped in to help Sarah with household repairs and errands while James was away. Thomas, who had no idea that his best friend had betrayed him in ways that went far deeper than stealing the woman he loved. Now, in the belly of a ship headed toward the most heavily fortified beach in Europe, James Mitchell pulled out his writing paper and began to compose his final words. He knew the statistics. He had heard the officers whispering about expected casualty rates for the first wave. 70%, 80%. Some said higher. He did not expect to survive the morning. If these were to be his last words, he decided, they would be the truth. The first letter, to Sarah, was the hardest to begin. "My dearest Sarah," he wrote, his hand cramping as the ship pitched. "By the time you read this, I will be gone. I want you to know that I have loved you the best I knew how, but I have not loved you the way you deserved. I have carried a weight that I cannot bring home to you, and so I will leave it here, in these words, hoping that the truth will be lighter for you to carry than my lies have been." He told her everything, the affair with Margaret, the pregnancy, his suspicion that the child Sarah was carrying might not be his, given the timing and the months they had been apart before his departure. He wrote that he did not deserve her forgiveness, but he needed her to know the truth before he met whatever end awaited him on the beach. The second letter, to Thomas,
was shorter, but perhaps more painful. "Tom," he wrote, "you have been a better friend to me than I have ever been to you. You have loved Sarah with a purity I could never match, and you have supported her while I have been gone. I know you hoped she would choose you all those years ago. I stole that chance from you, not because I loved her more, but because I was selfish and did not understand what I was taking. If I do not return, I release her to you. Love her the way I could not. Raise my child, if it is mine, with the decency I have lacked. You deserve the life I have wasted." The third letter was the one he wrote with tears streaming down his face, smudging the ink. "Margaret," he began, and then had to stop because his throat was closing. "I do not have the words for what I have done to you. I took your youth and your trust, and I gave you nothing but shame and fear in return. I pray that you have found peace, whatever that means for you. I pray that you will find love with a man who can give you the life you deserve. I will carry you with me into whatever comes tomorrow. If there is a God, and if he judges me, I will accept that judgment. But know that in the moments before the end, it will be your face I see. It will be your name on my lips. Forgive me if you can. Forget me if you must." He sealed the 3 letters just as the ship's loudspeaker crackled to life. An officer's voice, steady and calm, began giving final instructions. They would load into the Higgins boats at 400 hours. They would hit the beach at 6:30. They were going to win the war today. James tucked the letters inside his uniform jacket, close to his heart. Around him, men gathered their gear, checked their weapons one last time, and tried to appear braver than they felt. Someone started singing a hymn, and others joined in, their voices creating a strange, haunting harmony in the cramped quarters. James did not sing. He sat with his secrets pressed against his chest and waited for the dawn. The ramp of the Higgins boat dropped at exactly 6:32 hours on June 6, 1944. And James Mitchell stepped into a nightmare beyond anything the human mind could have prepared him for. The beach was not a beach, it was a killing ground. Bodies floated in the surf, turning the water pink. Machine gun fire tore through the air with a sound like ripping cloth. Mortars exploded, throwing sand and metal and pieces of men into the sky. The noise was so overwhelming that James could not hear himself screaming. He ran. Every instinct in his body told him to turn around, to swim back to the ship, to surrender or die or anything but move forward into that wall of metal and death. But training took over where courage failed, and his legs carried him through the surf, over bodies and obstacles and wire, toward the seawall 200 yards away.
Men fell around him. A soldier whose name he did not know took a bullet to the face and dropped like a marionette with cut strings. Another stepped on a mine and simply ceased to exist. The man running beside James, a kid from Ohio who had shown everyone pictures of his baby daughter the night before, made it 10 steps onto the beach before machine gun fire stitched a line across his chest. James made it 60 yards before the bullet found him. It hit him in the left side, just below his ribs, and the force of it spun him around and knocked him flat. He lay in the sand, trying to understand what had happened, watching his blood soak into the beach. The pain came a moment later, bright and all-consuming. He tried to get up and could not. He tried to call for a medic and had no breath to shout. Around him the battle raged on, but it seemed suddenly distant, as if he were watching it through thick glass. He thought about his letters, still tucked inside his jacket. He hoped they would find them. He hoped Sarah would understand. Corporal Danny Reeves, a medic from the 116th Medical Detachment, found James 20 minutes later. By then, the initial waves had pushed past the beach, and medics were moving among the wounded, performing triage with grim efficiency. Reeves took one look at James's wound and knew he was not going to make it. The bleeding was too severe, the damage too extensive. But Reeves had been trained to try anyway. He dragged James to a somewhat sheltered position behind a destroyed tank obstacle and began working on the wound, knowing it was probably futile, but unable to stop himself from trying. As he worked, something fell from James's jacket. 3 envelopes, blood-stained now, scattered in the sand. Reeves grabbed them instinctively, not wanting anything to be lost. Later, when there was a break in the chaos, he looked at them, saw they were letters, saw they were addressed to people back home. Reeves made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. He opened them and read them. He read about the affair, the betrayal, the pregnancy, the lies. He read the confessions of a dying man, and he understood immediately the devastation these words would cause. He thought about the wife, 6 months pregnant, who would receive news that her husband was dead, and then receive these letters destroying everything she believed about him. He thought about the best friend who would learn he had been betrayed by the person he trusted most. He thought about the sister who would be exposed and shamed. Corporal Danny Reeves made a choice. He tucked the letters into his own pack and told himself he would mail them later, when he had time to think, when he could decide what to do. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and as the Allied forces fought their way across France and into Germany, Reeves never sent them. Every time he tried, he remembered the words in those letters and could not bring himself to inflict that pain on people who had already lost so much. James Mitchell died on the beach at Normandy at approximately 1400 hours on June 6, 1944. His body was one of thousands that were collected, identified, and buried in temporary graves that would later become the permanent American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. His personal effects were sent home to his widow. The letters were not among them. In August 1944, Sarah Mitchell gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Elizabeth, after James's mother. She raised Elizabeth alone, working as a nurse and keeping her husband's memory alive through stories of his courage and kindness. She never remarried, though Thomas Brennan remained in her life as a devoted friend who helped her raise Elizabeth and never once mentioned his own feelings. Thomas Brennan became a teacher, like James had been. He lived 3 blocks from Sarah and Elizabeth and was at every birthday party, every school play, every important moment of Elizabeth's childhood. He died in 1992, having never married, and left everything he owned to Elizabeth with a note that said simply, "Your father would have been proud of you." Elizabeth Mitchell grew up believing her father was a hero who died on D-Day, fighting for freedom. She became a history professor, specializing in World War II, writing books about the ordinary men who did extraordinary things. She gave lectures about the greatest generation and the sacrifices they made. She never knew that her father's last thoughts were not of glory or country, but of guilt and forbidden love. Danny Reeves kept the letters hidden for 40 years. He could not bring himself to destroy them, but he could not send them either. He carried them through the rest of the war, brought them home to his small farm in Virginia, and locked them in an ammunition box in his attic. He told himself that someday he would decide what to do with them, but that day never came. In 1986, Reeves died of a heart attack while working in his field. His wife, Clara, found the ammunition box while cleaning out the attic and assumed it contained war memorabilia. She sold it, along with most of Danny's other possessions, to an antique dealer who specialized in military items. The dealer sold it to a collector in France. The collector died, the collection was scattered, and eventually the box ended up in the attic of a farmhouse near the Normandy beaches, until Philip Rousseau found it in 2018. When Rousseau realized what he had discovered, he contacted historians specializing in D-Day research. They were able to trace the letters back to James Mitchell through military records and eventually located his daughter, Elizabeth, now 74 years old and living in Colorado. A historian named Dr. Rachel Morrison was given the task of contacting Elizabeth and explaining what had been found. It was one of the hardest conversations she had ever had to have. She met Elizabeth at her home on a cold afternoon in November 2018 and showed her the letters her father had written 74 years earlier. Elizabeth read them in silence. Dr. Morrison watched as the elderly woman's face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, shock, grief, and finally something that looked almost like understanding. When she finished reading, Elizabeth sat for a long time without speaking.
"My mother never knew," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "She died believing he loved her completely. She died believing I was his daughter, conceived in love." Dr. Morrison did not know what to say. "Would you rather not have known?" she finally asked. Elizabeth looked at the letters again, at her father's shaky handwriting, at the bloodstains that had turned brown with age. "I don't know," she said honestly. "He was so young, 22 years old, terrified, believing he was about to die. People make mistakes. People carry burdens they should not have to carry. He was just a boy trying to be a man in impossible circumstances." She paused, touching the paper gently. "But yes," she admitted, "part of me wishes these had stayed hidden. Part of me wishes I could still believe the story I grew up with." In the months following the discovery, Elizabeth did her own research. She found records of Margaret Hayes, her aunt, whom she barely remembered meeting. She learned that Margaret had died in 2003, taking her secrets to the grave. She looked through old photographs and saw her own face reflected in Margaret's features and wondered if the blood that ran in her veins was not the blood she had always believed it was. She tracked down medical records, did DNA testing, consulted with genealogists. The answer, when it finally came, was anticlimactic. She was James Mitchell's biological daughter. The timing of her mother's pregnancy aligned with James's leave before shipping out. Whatever had happened between James and Margaret, Elizabeth was not the result of it. But knowing the biological truth did not erase the emotional truth. Her father had betrayed her mother. Her father had carried secrets that poisoned him. Her father had written these letters believing they would bring some kind of peace, but all they had brought, 74 years later, was pain. Elizabeth decided to donate the letters to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where they are now part of an exhibit on the personal experiences of soldiers. She gave permission for them to be displayed, believing that if her father's words had to exist in the world, they should at least serve some purpose beyond causing hurt. She wrote her own letter, to be displayed alongside her father's, explaining what she had learned and what she believed. In it, she wrote, "My father was not a hero in the way we like to imagine heroes. He was flawed, guilty, inhuman, but he was also brave enough to face death with honesty, even if that honesty came too late and was never received by those it was meant for. Perhaps that is its own kind of courage, or perhaps it is simply the desperate act of a young man trying to find peace in his final hours. I do not know. I do not have the right to judge him. I only know that he was my father, and that he carried more weight into battle than any soldier should have to bear." The letters remain on display, behind glass, protected from time, but exposed to the world. Thousands of people pass by them every year, reading the words of a man who died believing he had unburdened his soul, never knowing that his confessions would sleep in darkness for 7 decades before finding the light. The ammunition box that held them sits in a climate-controlled storage room in the museum's archives, a silent witness to the choices made by men in impossible circumstances. Danny Reeves's name is noted in the records as the medic who preserved the letters, though the museum does not speculate on why he kept them hidden for so long. Some questions have no good answers. Some truths are too complicated to be explained in simple terms. The story of James Mitchell and his unsent letters is one of those stories. It is a story about love and betrayal, courage and weakness, truth and the sometimes merciful lies we tell to protect the people we care about. It is a story that asks us to consider, if you knew your words would cause pain, would you still speak them? If you had the power to hide a truth that would shatter someone's world, would you use it? And if you were given letters meant to destroy the memory of someone you loved, would you read them, or would you let them burn? Danny Reeves made his choice. Philippe Rousseau made his. Elizabeth Mitchell made hers. Each of them tried to do what they thought was right in the face of impossible circumstances. Each of them had to live with the consequences. And somewhere, on a beach in Normandy, where the tide still washes in and out, the sand holds secrets of its own. Letters that were sent and never received. Words that were spoken and never heard. The last thoughts of young men who believed they were about to die and wanted to leave something of themselves behind. Some of those words found their way home. Some did not.
And in the end, perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all, that the things we most desperately want to say are often the things that should never be heard.